Hi everyone and welcome to Trauma Informed Support. I'm your host Dr. Kay Eyre. In this episode we interview filmmaker and activist James Redford. James Redford is a world-renowned filmmaker with several documentaries and feature filmmaking credits to his name. James turned his storytelling eye on the hidden menace of adverse childhood experiences in his groundbreaking documentary Paper Tigers. Set within and around the campus of Lincoln Alternative High School in the rural community of Walla Walla in Washington, Paper Tigers attempts to answer the following questions. What does it mean to be a trauma-informed school? And how do you educate teens whose childhood experience have left them with a brain and body ill-suited to learning? In his search for clear and honest answers based in science, James embarked on his latest film, Resilience, the biology of stress and the science of hope. In Resilience, we learn about how traumatic stress can trigger hormones that wreak havoc with the bodies and brains of children, putting them at a great risk for disease, homelessness, prison time, and even early death. It also chronicles the dawn of a movement that is determined to fight back. Pediatricians, psychologists, and educators using cutting-edge science and field-tested therapies to protect children from the dark legacy of abuse and neglect that no child would choose. James is interviewed by my colleague, Dr. Govind Krishnamurthy. I hope you find this interview interesting and useful.
James, thank you for speaking with me today.
An honor.
So thank you for making Paper Tigers and Resilience. For people who haven't watched it, would highly recommend it. They're excellent films. I was wondering if you could speak to what you find most surprising about making the films.
Well, I think probably just the response to the films themselves. Our feeling was that this was really important information to get out there, that the research that proves that toxic stress can really interfere with the way kids develop both neurologically and physically has been around for almost 20 years now. And the proof and the good hard science, but we're just not adopting that into how we think about how to help kids that have been in really stressful childhoods. And so, since it was so virtually unknown, I thought the heavy work was going to be getting people to believe it, or, you're going to have to really try and figure out how to get people to accept a new idea. But I think, by the time the movies came out, I think people were just ready for whatever reasons. I mean, there's a long-standing observation among a lot of people who work at the crossroads of science and best actions, that it takes 15 to 20 years for groundbreaking research to work its way down into implementation. So, but you go around to these screenings, and the statistics are that a sizable portion of people have had really difficult childhoods, and the more difficult those childhoods are, the more there's abuse, neglect, and difficult, dangerous environments at the home, the more problems it creates then and later in life. Just the amount of people that show up, that want to know, that have reached out, that, when we started out with these films, we thought we might have, 20, 40 screenings in the US, weren't sure what would happen outside of that. We're approaching nearly 1,000 screenings right now around the world. And the sales have been off the charts. And I don't really say that to brag. It shocked us all. And I think it's a great indication of how real the science is and how many people struggle with these issues and don't want to talk about it or haven't. And this is clearly hitting a chord.
Yeah, that's quite an interesting story. I know when Kay and I started working together, we'd often go to schools and talk about trauma, and would have people who are there who we felt we were trying to convince of it. And so when we started this project, we thought, well, why don't we have the people who are interested come to us? And we were just like you. We thought we'd have a handful of people who would probably come, but there's so much interest in it, isn't there? What is your sense of that? I mean, people have their own personal histories of it that attracts them to it. Was there something else that do you think attracts people to this area?
Well, I think probably one of the most surprising things to me is that, you know, the original research that really was the bedrock of this idea was done by two doctors, one with the Center for Disease Control here in the States, and the other one, a physician in the state of California. And they looked at about 30,000 health records for patients inside the Kaiser Permanente health system. Now, these folks are they're largely affluent, largely educated, largely sort of, you know, white, upper middle to upper class, and the prevalence of these toxic experiences and linkages to poor outcomes later in life among this population was, you know, really, that was sort of the biggest surprise, because there's this myth that if you grow up behind the white picket fence and there's a car in the driveway and a dog in the yard, that there can't possibly be anything going wrong in that home or in those people's lives. And if they are going wrong, then you should be ashamed and not talk about it. And so I think, you know, that aspect of things, you know, is really interesting. And I've certainly seen that just personally in my own life. I mean, not necessarily my own personal experience, but just, you know, been surprised by, you know, the prevalence of these experiences among people who you just don't think would be up against that. So you look at that, you say, well, now let's throw a little poverty into that. Now let's throw a little institutionalized racism, historical racism in our country. Let's throw all that into the mix. What does that do? There's a lot.
Yeah. And with all of that, was there a factor, a statistic that really stood out to you that really cuts through to people in terms of how devastating the impact of those events are in people's lives?
Well, I mean, I think in some ways, I think the striking one is if you look at the statistics among people who are in the service provider industries, whether you're in social work or education or law enforcement or juvenile justice or, you know, pediatrician, people that work generally in the world of trying to help kids grow up healthy and sound. Their ACEs scores, meaning how well problematic their childhood was, the statistics among that population hovers around 30 to 35%. So the very people that we hope will take good care of our children at risk are having to manage their own difficult histories. And that's an important thing. I think, you know, understanding, we can talk about that, you know, just for teachers, just how often you're asking a teacher to overcome their own triggers and their own histories in the face of problematic behavior or difficult kids. And it's hard to do. So I think that statistic is really important, because it's not just about the children, it's about everybody.
Yeah, and there's couple of really moving stories in Paper Tigers, particularly of teachers talking about that. And I just wondered, like, was there a story or anecdote that you didn't include in the movie that people would be interested in from your work in trying to make the movie, James?
Well, you know, I think I would say I've always, you know, you have a conscience as a documentary filmmaker. Sometimes you have to make a choice between what would be most striking or engaging as film content alone versus what it might do to share moments or scenes with the public. Does the subject you're working with really comprehend the ramifications of sharing certain things or revealing certain things? And sometimes you have to make a call as to whether or not, is this for the greater good, or is this unnecessary? Is this going to potentially inflict more damage? And, you know, particularly in Paper Tigers, we were interacting with a student and a mother, and the situation in their lives was so, it spun so out of control. She had what we refer to as a score of 10 aces, which is, you know, by the ACEs terminology, which is just one way to deal with it. She probably had every, you know, stressful, traumatic experience one could have as a child. And her son was growing up with a similar profile. And this is something you see, generational trauma being passed down. And, you know, to sort of tell their story, I was convinced that in the long run, it might create more havoc in their lives in the long term than really serve the film in the short term. So it didn't include that story. There are other times where one of the things I did with the film is told all the teenagers in Paper Tigers that I would screen the final cut before it was locked with them. And then one of the ways I think I gained their trust, I said, I'll show you the film, and if something upsets you and you don't want it in, I'll take it out, because you're minors and you're still growing up. You don't, it's a transitional period in terms of how you see life and how you see yourself and how you want to be remembered. So, one of the young ladies told a really, really powerful story about abuse in her life. And she came to me and said, if you include the story, I'm afraid for my life. So I didn't include it. But it's hard, because you have to sort of, at the same time, you have to realize, we're not talking about everyday emotional dramas or injuries that happen to all of us. So many people are experiencing things that are harrowing and suppressed, and we're not comfortable talking about them. So it's hard to draw that line between, what's best for all versus protecting the subjects.
Yeah, that's such a tricky one. And we've spoken to a lot of teachers who've had young people come and tell them about circumstances in their life. And I think you can go both ways, can't you? You can either just completely not talk about it at all, and because you just, you can't handle some of the material and you just want to not make it worse for the young person, or you don't know what to do with it. So you sort of, without sufficient permission, I guess, start acting on that material, which is not helpful either.
Yeah, it takes, say, real professional training and understanding.
Yeah. I was thinking about the story about the mother and the daughter and how it's intergenerational, and we've sort of heard whispers of this in meetings and other church teachers, where there's a sense of kind of helplessness about how these things cascade through families, and teachers often, especially when you've put in the hard yards and things are not working, you can slip into the sense of, maybe nothing really helps this family or this child. What was your sense of that? I mean, clearly Paper Tigers was a hopeful kind of story in many ways. What was your sense of how people can think about that for these young people?
That's a good question, because you don't want to just, paint an overly optimistic picture. You make it, and what happened in Paper Tigers at that point in time when the film ended, graduate, that was the truth. It was a remarkable accomplishment for all of them. That didn't mean they all went on to have, easy and carefree lives. They've continued to wrestle with their histories. I mean, they're all, the kids that were featured in Paper Tigers, in the scheme of things, are doing really well. And when I say that, I mean, they're not, nobody's died from opioid abuse. Nobody has ended up in jail. Everybody's working at some level. Sometimes I feel like, the expectations are too high. And sometimes I think, it's funny, because there used to be this thing where there was vocational training. And then we decided, well, that's vocational training is sort of not giving, is the idea that, deciding at too early of an age that your future is limited to this vocation or not going to college. But at the same time, I think more important than anything for kids in terms of their survival and just leading lives in which they can have happy lives and have loving, stable relationships with people, because it all has to go from there, in my opinion. I mean, your chances of being able to hold a stable job, lead a productive life, if you manage to somehow get support to get through high school, get support through college, but you haven't figured out how to sort of be in this world in a productive way, emotionally, socially, the degree isn't going to get you anywhere. You have to have that ability to sort of move through life making reasonably good decisions and being able to have healthy relationships with other people. So, my feeling about teachers is that sometimes I feel like, I don't think they should inflate grades, but I also feel like it's okay to say, given what this kid, his history, and given everything he's been through, the fact that he's here at school at all and he's managing to pull off a C, I shouldn't make him feel bad about that. I should be a little bit more tolerant of his performance because, up against other profiles of kids, that C may be more impressive than an A. We just don't look underneath the surface. We see the tip of the iceberg and the kid falling asleep in class, turning in late work, maybe it's shoddily done, but you're not realizing that in the middle of the night, the police came by to arrest his dad for beating up on his mom, and he hasn't had a good meal in 3 days. And that shrink that he's supposed to go to across town, he doesn't know how to get there. He doesn't have health insurance. It's overwhelming. So, for teachers in general, I think there is hope. I think you just have to sort of just aim at the most important, realistic things and keep it simple.
Mm-hmm.
And also self-care. I think teachers in the States, I don't know what it's like in Australia, but teachers in the States seem to be expected to solve all of society's ills in the classroom these days. And so, you have to be very mindful of how much you're trying to tackle. I mean, as you know from Paper Tigers, that was something that the teachers really struggled with. How do we sustain ourselves over the long term and not go so deep in and just get emotionally burned out? And that's about what you do outside of the classroom and how you manage your own stress and keep things in perspective.
Yeah, there is a price to often pay, isn't there? That when you're kind of working with kids like this, that you somehow bear witness to a lot of their kind of struggles, which does kind of change the way you think about yourself or your work or whatever it is. So that was really nicely discussed in the movie. So I really encourage people to take a look at that. I was really interested in your sort of storytelling process, just as someone who talks about trauma all day, every day. I was curious about how you structured some of the material to kind of help, tell a good story, but also help people feel as though they can take action on some of the content you're presenting to them.
Well, as you noticed, there are two movies. One is Paper Tigers, and one is Resilience. And Paper Tigers is more of a traditional documentary, although the way we wove in scientific research may not have been typical verite, but we felt that was important. But by and large, having the kids participate with me, create their own footage, be their own filmmakers in many cases, follow them for a year, just see what happened. It's a commitment just to see what happens. We didn't know how things were going to go and where things would go. The movie was going to be what it was. And I think, particularly when it comes to teenagers, I think that was the right approach. But there's a whole other aspect of this in which, an argumentative essay is what's needed, to help at the sort of public policy level, to help at the community level, to get people out of their silos and trying to understand that this is a new vocabulary, that whether you're a judge or a police officer, an educator, a pediatrician, that if you're all operating from the same base of knowledge about this stuff, that then you will work better together, because there's the right thing to do. If you're trauma informed, look at it, it's like, if you're a trauma informed pediatrician, you don't just stop at the stomach ache. If you can't figure it out, you say, well, maybe it's stress. If you're a teacher, you might say, well, where were you last night? Did you get any sleep? Or if you're a judge, you might want to know the history before an impulsive or bad decision caught up with a kid. Or, policemen might not want to re-traumatize. So that's what resilience is for. And, on a deeper level, I think, I've found over time, I don't know, I'm going on my 8th or 9th documentary now. And sometimes it's important to ring the alarm bell. Sometimes what you do, you need to light a stick of dynamite and just drop it and get everybody's attention. But then sometimes I feel like you really ought to offer solutions. Don't upset people when there are solutions to be had. And weaving solutions into the movies, both of them in a way, is really hard. I mean, the films would be a lot easier if you just let it rip on the negative, right? We're primal, we're fear-based. It's the quickest way our brain responds is fear for survival. And so that's a very easy way to engage the audience. So, shaping resilience in these little mini chapters was all about trying to build a sense that this is very important, but it's not dire. Hard.
Yeah, I'm sure it was. I really liked what you said about, not just feeding off of the fear and the concern or whatever. It's not just about the headlines, but actually giving people something meaningful to take away from the film, which is something we try to do in the training, to keep things really practical. So even if there's one thing that they can walk away from, they don't drown and kind of feeling helpless about it all, they can kind of act on it.
Yes, for sure.
Yeah. So I was curious if you had any more thoughts about this piece about teacher burnout. So part of what we're kind of going through here in Australia, it's very similar to, it sounds like, to what's happening there in the United States, is teachers feel this overwhelming burden of increasing number of things that they sort of have to do. So it's about us integrating it into whatever kind of practice that's prevailing there, but keeping it trauma informed. In terms of quite practical things, what did you notice through the making of the documentary that actually helped sort of in school, between the staff, or even outside of work, that helped for these teachers, James?
I feel that a holistic approach, education. Well, first of all, the stress is neurotoxic, so for kids it's insidious. But you walk into a class, like in Resilience, you may remember there was a little section where I visited like a first, second grade class, 6, 7-year-old kids. Running around having a good time. And you walk into that room at first glance, you say, hey, bunch of kids having fun. What's the problem? But what's going on in their lives is insidious, and it might not present immediately in stark ways, but on an ongoing basis as they mature, and then as their bodies change during hormonal development, so many things begin to happen. And that sort of understanding that, for teachers, I think you have this. You have to think about. The core is that unless these kids are more healthy, whether it's neurologically or physically, it's going to be really hard for teachers to teach. So if you really want to if you're in an at-risk population where a lot of stuff's going on, the idea of providing total care in a school environment is really powerful, and I think it makes it a lot easier for the kids. For instance, having a health center that's just woven into the school, maybe that seems excessive or exorbitant, but what it does is then you have professionals on site who are trained to deal with these issues. And when a kid is having trouble in a classroom, it's not just a punitive moment where they get kicked out or suspended. They often get referred to psychological counseling on the spot to help de-escalate. Or they go in and they talk to a doctor, and the doctor says, you haven't had a regular meal in 2 weeks. You're like walking around radically impaired. We need to get you fed. That aspect of it, expecting the teachers to do all of that is not realistic. And so it's not about giving the teachers more to do. It's about creating a more supportive environment for them. Because in the end, they're educators. If they wanted to be pediatricians or social workers or psychologists, they would have gone a different way in their lives. And as an example for anyone that's interested, if you want to look at a really interesting program in New York right now, there's an organization called The Door that provides assistance to kids who are struggling. And they recently merged with the school. And the school and this organization are now housed under the same roof. And I think it's an extension and an evolution of the kinds of things that we saw at Lincoln High School and Paper Tigers. So.
Sorry, Jim, was that The Door, did you say?
Yes, The Door.
Yeah.
The Door.
Yeah, The Door.
Or something like that. You can Google it.
Yeah, we'll put up a link for
Manhattan,
it.
Right in the, kids in ground zero in difficult situations.
I think that was what was striking in Paper Tigers, was this idea of how integrated those approaches were, that, you had people working together to help the kids. And I think sometimes, I don't know what it's like there, but we work in our little silos, healthcare and education and all that. And because we're not talking to each other about things, it can feel really broken. And there's sort of gaps in how we help kids and families, I think, for which I think the kids pay the greatest price a lot of the times. Yeah.
Yeah, I think probably that's the significant thing that I would hope would happen as a result of the emergence of toxic stress and the awareness of adverse childhood experiences and trauma and how it affects kids, is that the most important thing to me is to create a more comprehensive, holistic environment to deal with these issues.
Yeah,
So,
that's great. So I was checking in to see what you were currently curious about in your work, and if it had anything to do with trauma or what you were working on next.
well, so I have two different avenues for my documentary work. I tend to fall in one direction or another. They're all environmental in a way because these are environmental issues what are happening in people's lives. But I also do a lot of work in the traditional environmental landscape, and I have a film coming out on HBO at the end of December called "Happening: A Clean Energy Revolution." And I spent 3 years struggling to understand clean energy and why it was ramping up so quickly and what it means for a future which is largely positive. Talk about another solutions-based film. This is a humdinger in that regard. And even though there were some really difficult times in terms of watching the political process get in the way, ultimately it's happening, and that's why I named the film that. So, and then as for Karen Pritzker and I, my partner at Kate Fitzgerald, we really made these films together. It's important to say we are now really looking deeply at where we go next, but we're not quite sure. But for the most part, we're really interested in trying to make things better for kids, and I'm sure we'll stay in that terrain.
Yeah, that's great. Was there any last messages or thoughts you had for the educators or people listening, James, to the podcast?
Oh, just, I think people dealing with teenagers in the classroom, it's not personal. It's not personal. And think of it as a symptom rather than an insult if you can. It's hard to do, but it makes such a difference.
That's great. Well, thank you so much. I'm sure our listeners are grateful for this interview, but also for your work on the two films. It's made an enormous difference in people getting interested in it. There will be some local screenings of the film, so we'll keep you in the loop about that. And if you're ever down our way, we would love to hear of you doing screenings or talks or whatever it is. So thank you very much.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thanks, James.
Take care.
That was our interview with James Redford. Thank you to James for sharing his insights from his groundbreaking films, Paper Tigers and Resilience. To access the information and links discussed in the interview, check out the show notes at www.tipbs.com. If you are enjoying listening to the show, please go to iTunes to rate and review it. Your ratings make all the difference. Thank you for listening. See you next time.